Just move to the internet. It's great here. We get to live inside where the weather is always awesome. John Green. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. As of March 4th, 2025, that's the day we're recording this, TikTok is still operational in the United States. It was due to shut down on January 19th, and it did for about 24 hours, not even, before Trump signed an executive order to extend the deadline for ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, to sell off its American operations to new American owners. The new deadline is April 5th. So there's a month left of BookTok as well. That's the massive book community on TikTok. Now, I know a decent amount of people would be happy to see BookTok go. It's always gotten a ton of hate for being supposedly shallow, materialistic, and performative. You can't deny, though, that BookTok has been hugely influential on the publishing industry as a whole in the past few years, especially after the pandemic. And the prospect of seeing it just poof, disappear has a lot of people in the industry freaking out. It's also getting a lot of people excited about the potential of a post-BookTok publishing industry. So that's a bit of a primer on where TikTok and BookTok stand right now. But I wanted to dig a little deeper into BookTok to really understand that community, to figure out what the hell is going on there and how it ended up being so influential. Alina is a UK-based YouTuber. She's Alina from the According to Alina YouTube channel that's very successful. She has 2 literature degrees, whose channel I recently binged in large part because of her video essay style videos on BookTok. Alina, how's it going? Thank you so much for making time, eh?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, this is super exciting. And when I say I binge your channel, I really mean it, seriously. And the reason that I wanted you on for this talk is because I see you as somewhat of a subject matter expert on BookTok. You've made quite a few videos on this. And just to give the people an idea, I wanted to share a few video titles to give them an idea. These have all easily gotten over 100,000 views. BookTok and Overconsumption. BookTok romance books are bad for women, sort of. BookTok and anti-intellectualism. F the BookTokers who don't read. So let's start at what BookTok really is. Like, if I were to go on there right now, like, what kind of content are you seeing? Well, what's on there?
That's a great question, and I think one that people typically give very simplistic answers to, because what is BookTok, right? It's an online community
It's huge.
on the social media app TikTok, where people post about books. And there is admittedly a huge amount of people on there talking about romance books specifically, and more so noteworthy, let's say, in the press and in sort of public discourse is the dark romance and the smut community, because those are the spicier headlines, let's say. But there are really people talking about all sorts of books and literature in general on there. It's a very widely ranging community of people who are super, super excited about books, and they just want to talk about it all the time.
And we're talking book reviews, recommendations, lists. What am I missing?
Book reviews, reading vlogs. People love to give recommendations of their favorite independent bookstores, for example. People love to make little listicles, sort of books that changed my life, books that got me through my 20s, books to read when you're sad, books to read to get you through a breakup, that sort of thing, which I find fascinating. I mean, it's interesting to get insight into where people go for comfort.
Do you find comfort from it? Like, where do you personally stand on TikTok? Do you consume it?
Yes, I spend an embarrassing amount of time on TikTok and on BookTok specifically. There are specific people that I enjoy watching, whatever they say, I know I'll enjoy it. And then there are also other people that I watch more so from like a human interest perspective, sort of,
Hmm.
oh, I would never read that myself, but interesting that this is how you interact with this specific book.
And BookTok has a massive reach. A lot of the creators there
Mm.
regularly get millions of views and likes on their videos. It's very
Yes.
influential. So the way you put it, it all sounds pretty wholesome and harmless.
Mm.
Where does the hate come from?
Well, another great question. Who knows, really? It's hard
Hmm.
to pinpoint exactly when the hate started and whether it is just people hating to be haters because that's a feature of the internet, or if people actually have valid points in their criticism of book talk. I think the fact that romance and the so-called spicy books are so popular on book talk plays a huge role in this. Obviously, people have been reading romance and erotica books for ages. Um, I I recently went to Romania, which is where I'm from, to my grandfather's house, and I found a bunch of those sort of Mills and Boons, very cheesy cover romance novels that my mom used to read back in the 90s.
Okay.
So clearly, people have been reading this type of book for a very long time, but it's now super popular to talk about it. I guess they used to be a bit of a guilty pleasure for a lot of women. And now there are these young women online who are talking about it and sort of recommending them to each other and hyping them up essentially. And some of these books are now the best selling books in the world. So, for people who take literature a little bit more seriously, I can see why this might be annoying because it's not exactly the most literary type of writing, let's say. And I don't know, the idea of or identity of being a reader or a serious reader in inverted commas is something that people are very gatekeepy
Right.
around. And so people get touchy when somebody calls themselves a reader or brags about reading hundreds of books a year only to then discover that it's, pulp fiction. And then there is, the more valid criticism of particularly the fact that there's a bit of a consumerist aspect to book talk, or the fact that literature is getting more quote unquote tropified. There's a lot of reading revolving around trendy tropes right now. And the fact that some of these romance books, particularly in the dark romance, more explicit genre, are a little bit disturbing and the marketing for them isn't always clear. People are not getting the appropriate trigger warnings and stuff like that. So it's
Hmm.
it's a bit of everything, really.
So I know that TikTok always gets a lot of hate just generally, and so does
Mm,
romance outside of TikTok. So you're
yeah.
combining both those things, TikTok and
Yeah.
romance, book talk. There you go. It's a storm of hate that gets targeted, right?
Yep.
And I know that romance is heavily tropified,
Hmm.
specifically as a genre. Can you dig into that? What do you mean by the tropification of books through TikTok?
I mean, I think tropes and just more generally themes have always been like a recurring issue in literature. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily that authors or publishers are just copying one another because that's what's selling at the moment. Sometimes it is a question of what the zeitgeist is. Writing books takes time, right? And publishing and putting them out there also takes time. So it's not like you can immediately copy somebody else's idea. Sometimes when a specific trope comes out in a bunch of different books is because those people were pretty much writing at the same time, but there is also a concern around the kind of stuff that publishers are acquiring. And when, let's say one of the big five publishers acquires a book with a specific trope or theme, you then have another that gets publicized in the sort of trade media. And then you have another three or four big publishers buying the same thing because they want to compete with that or capitalize on that trend. So, in that sense, yeah, it is a little bit homogenizing to what gets written. But I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know. I find there's very little that makes me sort of clutch my pearls and think, oh my God, literature is ending. I mean, people have been writing for millennia. I'm sure we will survive this too. But I also see why some people might be a little bit more concerned.
Can you give us examples of tropes that have become very popular? They're very specific, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, in the romance space, I don't remember exactly who it was who said that there are only 7 plots. In the romance space, this is definitely true. There's the enemies to lovers that everybody loves. So, loves and hates, I guess, because it gets a lot of criticism, but it's the sort of Pride and Prejudice plot line. So 2 people are kind of at odds with each other or actively hate each other, and then they slowly fall in love. There is also a friends to lover trope that is interesting. There's always a sort of the so-called cozy setting. So 2 people falling in love at a cafe or working at a flower store or a bookshop even, and then they slowly fall in love. The forced proximity trope where, I don't know, 2 people are working together or studying together. That's also very popular. It's obviously an interesting rom-com sort of revolves around a point of contention that then resolves and everybody gets this happy ending situation happening. And in terms of themes and sort of subgenres, something that has been growing in popularity and is at a bit of a peak right now is the romantasy.
Oh yeah, of course.
Subgenre
with Rebecca Yarros, yeah. Yes. Rebecca J. Moss. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so both of them are, I think, 2 of the best-selling authors in the world right now with these series, and people love them and people love to criticize them, and I can see why. I haven't read any of them, but there are a couple of YouTubers who do really good commentary around them and sort of read the books and then go through what is going on in them and what's wrong with them. And it's very much like Twilight. I mean, if you've ever watched one of the movies or read the books, I've read the first Twilight book and I was like, yeah, I kind of get it. I mean, it's what every young person dreams of, right? Being special, being in love, the world revolving around them. It's appealing.
Interesting. So you're saying that Twilight is very similar to the romantasy that's popular now, only came out like 20 years before romantasy at its peak. Huh.
Yes, a lot of people think of Twilight as the OG romantasy, like the ancient texts,
The precursor text, right?
Exactly.
So what I'm hearing is that these tropes, like romantasy, like enemies to lovers, they're very specific, but then they get very popular. Mm-hmm. Lots of videos get made about them on TikTok, and publishers pick up on that trend, and they then publish more of those books. Yeah. If I'm understanding correctly, the problem here is that you end up getting a homogenization of themes, or there's a bit of a glut of very samey books. Is it really that much of a problem that people are getting what they want, or is this like artificial?
That's a good question. Obviously, it's hard to quantify. In my opinion, people who were going to read a sort of I don't like to criticize people's tastes. If you want to read romance or if you want to read commercial pulp fiction, whatever you want to call it, good for you.
Yeah, amen to
But
that.
in the eyes of more aspirational people, this is a sort of silly romance book. Um, and in my opinion, somebody who is going to read a silly romance book was never going to start with Proust, right? So if they want to read more of that until they sort of develop a better understanding of their taste as a reader, or how serious they want to get about deep diving into literature, I don't think that's that big of an issue. Let them do it. People
Hmm.
who love literary fiction are always going to look for literary fiction. Um, Taken to an extreme, maybe this sort of super popularity of romance fiction, and more so sort of smut and dark romance fiction, might lead to bookstores perhaps stocking primarily that type of book because they're businesses and they need to stay in business. But I don't see literary fiction going anywhere, and I don't think that the thing threatening literary fiction is the popularity of the romance genre. I think people will always want to write the next great American novel or what have you, and what they need is facilities like public funding,
Hmm.
the ability to go to school and study creative writing, and have literary prizes to participate in and get support in that way. That's my opinion.
Romance is tricky, right?
Mm,
Because I think everything you just said is very valid. But you made an especially good point that the publishing industry is a business after all. And
yeah.
romance is the best selling genre by far. It's not even close. And that's why it's a huge part of Book Talk as well. It's just a reflection of the publishing industry as a whole.
Yeah.
You you had a video about how romance romance books, or at least TikTok romance books, can be problematic for women. You also said sort of. Do you want to elaborate on that? Like, what's your take there?
Yeah, well, that is one of my more
Mm,
controversial titles, let's
mm.
say.
It's pretty fun
Brackets
though.
brackets sort of, because this is a claim that gets made a lot, right? Romance books are, especially dark romance books, are bad for women because they popularize or glamorize these themes of difficult toxic relationships, sometimes actually like physically abusive, in the way that the latest big romance title, the Colleen Hoover It Ends With Us, is. It's a book that is very much about a person who has undergone domestic abuse. But to many people, the way that those themes are presented in these books make them not aspirational, but they glamorize them in a way.
Yeah, I see.
Um, they perpetuate this idea that in order for a relationship to be desirable, it has to be difficult, and there have to be these incredibly intense emotions, and sometimes physically violent interactions between the two people in the relationship, and the idea that possessiveness and jealousy are good things to have in a romantic relationship. And the concern is that if young women read this type of book,
And they are.
they,
They
and they
absolutely are.
are, right, that is kind of the main demographic. Although there's something to be said about also sort of middle-aged women. There's like a gap between
Mm.
25 and sort of 55, and then it starts again. Um, But the idea is, the concern is this, right? That young people, young women specifically, will be reading these books and they will be somehow primed to accept abusive men in their lives, which is obviously a fair point. We do, to some extent, create our realities based on the things that we see in media,
In
which is
fiction,
why,
right?
yeah, which is why, representation and inclusivity is so important in media. But at the same time, it is also a little bit patronizing. Like I'm pretty sure the average 16 to 25-year-old girl can distinguish between fiction and reality, and what is an escapist book that they're reading for fun and what is something that they would want in their own life. It's, to me, a little bit like, oh, we must protect the silly women from the sexy books, otherwise they're going to get brainwashed type statement, which gives me pause a little bit. And I think in that particular video, I was referring to a bunch of studies that periodically come out where somebody or other is trying to determine whether or not the things that we read, in the way that some video games might encourage violence in young boys, would these books also encourage a predisposition to accept violent behavior in some women? And they're always inconclusive, of course, but they make for good news
They
headlines,
do,
right?
yeah. You see them everywhere.
Yeah. So that's kind of what the.
Yeah, it's I kind of understand the hate because when you put it that way, where it's like problematic and it's like rewiring the brains of young women, or at least that's the perception, you can understand where the hate is coming from.
100%. Yeah.
Right? It's kind of understandable. And you see a lot of this hate from male creators, especially because there's this whole parallel community to Book Talk, which all they do is hate on Book Talk. And you talked about this in one of your videos, Book Talk and anti-intellectualism, F the book talkers who don't read. You actually touch on this like parallel community that just hates on TikTok. Do you want to touch on that? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, I've mentioned it a lot recently, and some people really don't like it because it is. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't engage with criticism towards TikTok. I myself create criticism towards TikTok in a lot of my videos. But it needs to be recognized that for some reason or other, either because the reading as a hobby in general is super popular or because TikTok is so popular, it's hard to determine which started it. But Book Talk is now a very popular topic. It's not just a big community, but it's also itself, in this very meta way, a popular thing to talk about. And so it's very easy to make content making fun of some of these books that people are reading on there because, again, some of them are very silly, right? It's werewolves having sex. I mean, come on.
Sounds pretty hot.
I'm sure it is if that's what you're into. But you can see how the jokes kind of write themselves. And a lot of
Yeah.
YouTube commentary in particular is sort of humor based. So it's very easy to make fun of these things and to just shake your head and be like, oh my God, no, this is so bad. It's guaranteed views, essentially. And I think that this is part of people don't like to think that their favorite creator might be making content for money or for views, but they do. Like, that's their job, right? And it would be ridiculous to expect them not to care about their video being successful. And if a specific topic is successful right now and trending, wouldn't you be making content about that? And although everybody is talking about critical thinking at the moment a lot, it's a lot more difficult to engage with a nuanced discussion about something. It's very easy to be like, well, this thing is either 100% good or 100% bad, and this is why, and we can all join in sort of making fun of it or praising it.
So the problem is that book talk is short form. What is the maximum length for video on TikTok? 3 minutes, I think, maybe even less.
I think it's a little bit longer now.
Even if it's less than 10 minutes,
yeah.
10 minutes, is there a world where short form content can lead to productive, nuanced conversations? Like, is that even possible?
That is a good question. I mean, I sometimes think about a half an hour to 1 hour long YouTube video as just a jumping point, a starting point for
Right.
an actual conversation or like an ongoing reflection that you have with yourself. Sometimes I will even get in my comment section people saying, "Oh, I really loved your video, but also I was surprised you didn't touch on XYZ." And I understand why they're saying that, and I'm glad that they're pointing that out, that there's more to say, but that is exactly the point, right? I'm making a 20-minute video. I'm not going to solve anything in that space, right? It's just sort of a point where we can start a conversation. Obviously, it's a more in-depth presentation than what a TikTok allows you to do. I don't know if the point of TikTok is to have the conversations there or the point of social media in general. It's the issue is that a lot of people stop at the 5 minute or so TikTok and feel like they now have complete knowledge of a certain topic, right? In an ideal world, people would interact with social media to then go elsewhere and talk about it more and think about it in their own time and speak to their friends and, you know, regularly return to the topics that they're interacting with in their own time. But that doesn't always happen.
You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm Jacob Szymanski. I'm talking to Alina from the According to Alina YouTube channel about BookTok, the book community on TikTok. And this is in the context of a looming April 5th deadline to see if TikTok will continue to exist, be available in the United States. That would instantly deplatform the majority of TikTok's American users. And I see Alina as a bit of a subject matter expert on BookTok, and that's why we're here. And Alina, I wanted to ask you about this video you made on Barnes and Noble, because, and this was such a good video, by the way. And
Thank you.
You tackle the claim that BookTok basically saved Barnes and Noble. Barnes and Noble is a very popular bookstore chain in the United States and the UK, I think. What's the story there, and is that true? Did BookTok save Barnes and Noble?
Possibly. The evidence is inconclusive. I think that it definitely contributed in a big way. So for those who may not know, Barnes and Noble, as you say, is this massive bookstore chain in the US, started or was taken over and turned into what it is today at some point in the 80s. And all throughout the 90s, it was like the bookstore in the US. It was very much the place that was putting independent bookstores out of business before Amazon put Barnes and Noble out of business, essentially. Huge kind of like a department store, I guess. Huge bookstore that then started to slowly get dethroned by Amazon and was seriously struggling, I think, in the second half of the 20 teens until in 2019 it was acquired by some hedge fund, and they put this man called James Daunt in charge as the CEO. And he is known in the UK because there's a independent bookstore chain called Daunt Books that he started. And he also was in charge of a revamp of Waterstones, which is kind of the UK version of Barnes and Noble, I guess.
Oh, okay.
And his idea is that although this is a chain, it should be rooted in the local community and look as indie as possible and be inviting. And because Barnes and Noble previously kind of looked like a supermarket, it just had aisles and you could go and walk in and get...
like a Walmart, like just
Yeah.
straight aisles, fluorescent lights, right? Yeah, wow. That doesn't seem like what you would expect out of a bookstore, right?
No, not the coziest, not the most inspiring place to hang out in. So he's changed this, he's revamped it, and also started to move the stores into smaller buildings to sort of save money, I'm assuming, on rent and stuff like that. Anyways, it is now thriving. And at the beginning of the year, they announced that they will be opening something like 60 new stores in 2025, which is obviously a huge improvement, considering that in 2019 they were closing places down. It hasn't been that long, right? So a lot of people are thinking, well, who did this? BookTok, of course. Because in 2020, when it started to slowly get back out there as a business and become profitable again, is also the year that BookTok started to gain traction as a community on TikTok. Obviously, at the same time, that's when the pandemic was happening. Everybody was reading at the time. And in that video, I make a point that for a while, up to like 2021 or 2022, all of these news outlets, when they talk about what it was specifically that boosted book sales, they refer to the pandemic and not to BookTok, although BookTok was already very much a thing. Whereas now, nobody talks about the pandemic anymore. It's all BookTok, essentially.
Nobody wants to talk about the pandemic.
Well, exactly, right? Psychologically, I feel like
done.
we've pushed it down. We're done.
Yes.
It's done. It's done. But yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it's definitely American BookTok, and it's kind of, I feel like a huge proportion of people on BookTok are from the US. They definitely love Barnes and Noble. There's like a Barnes and Noble challenge that people do when they go to the store, and they have like 2 minutes to look around and then 3 minutes to put everything they can possibly put in their shopping carts, and then they just go and pay for it. And that's the challenge, just buy as much as you want.
That's so stupid. That is peak capitalism, isn't it?
Well, exactly, right? So
My God.
But it's exactly what you want as a business, right? Get people to come in and make it cool and fun to spend money here in person and not just order books online.
And Barnes and Noble has these tables and aisles in their stores.
Yeah.
They're specifically BookTok books. Like Barnes and Noble knows what's up. They know that they have an audience. But the way that they rearranged these stores to be smaller, cozier, to be more unique to the area, like it's not a copy paste from location to location. The aisles are smaller. It's more maze-like. They have chairs and stuff. It's fun to go to. It's very Instagrammable, right? And it plays into this other complaint the BookTok gets a lot. And that's that it encourages consumerism over the actual act of reading. There's more importance put on the purchase of books, the actual act of being a reader instead of the act of reading, right? You see these things called what do they call it? Like a hoard recap, like a what do they call it?
Like a haul?
Like a haul, yes, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Like these haul videos where people just show you what they bought, not necessarily what they read. And I don't know how to feel about this. It's hard to unpack. I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
It's complicated because obviously shopping for books and having a personal library, there is value in that. Many famous literary people have written about the book as a physical object and the pleasure of leafing through the pages and smelling that new book smell and
People
all
always talk
these
about
things.
the smell.
Right. It's like an experience that everybody loves, and I don't want to take away from that. Um, and I also understand people who talk about the fact that consumption is perhaps not the right word when it comes to books, because books don't have an expiry date and you can go back to them when you're later in life, whatever, they never lose their value, right? But at the same time, it's impossible not to acknowledge in good faith that social media has this aesthetic component that is very much about crafting a personal image and a personal brand and presenting oneself in a certain way. And it's very it's a popular thing to want to appear as a person who has the right hobbies and spends their time in the most productive way.
It kind of looks good on your image to be a person who
For
reads, right?
sure.
That's an attractive
Yeah,
thing for an influencer to want to have people think of them.
definitely. And I think everybody is attracted to the idea of being like a connoisseur of something. I don't know
Right.
if you remember this, but a while ago, everybody called themselves a foodie
I call myself
because
a foodie now.
well, exactly, right? You like to know it's because obviously everybody eats food. You need that. But it's when you're a foodie, it's more than that. You appreciate it more than the average person, right?
Mm.
It's kind of the same with crafting an image for yourself as like a reader. You're the type of person who doesn't just read the instructions or the where you're on the loo and you read the back of the shampoo bottle because you're bored. It's not that. You're engaging with what you're reading, more than the average person.
I think in one of your videos, you use the term, it's the hot girlification of reading.
Yeah.
And listen, this audience for AMI audiobook review has a bunch of blind people listening to it. And so these images of these bookstagram people,
Yeah.
what do they look like? Like especially the people that engage in this, the image of being a reader. Like what do those feeds look like?
I mean, I have one myself. I can just describe my own so that nobody
Okay, yeah,
gets,
go ahead.
nobody
Sure.
feels called out. I don't really post on it anymore, but at my peak when I was at university, it was like pictures of my shelves, pictures of my coffee cup at a cafe where I was studying with my notebook and whatever I was reading or writing about at the time. Pictures of underlined paragraphs that just happened to have my perfectly manicured nails in the shot
Oh
as well.
wow, I see.
It's like it's a whole you're creating a scene, right? It's not just that you're reading, but you are reading in this picture perfect, almost cinematic way.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing necessarily. I used to follow somebody at one point who enjoyed putting together outfits for themselves that reflected the mood or the color palette of a specific book cover. And it
I mean,
takes
everyone's
time
got
to
their
do that.
hobbies, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It takes time to do that. I couldn't be bothered. You know what I mean? I love clothes, but I don't know that I love them that much. I don't have an eye for putting together outfits in that way. So I'm not detracting from it as a hobby, but it is a little bit silly when you take a step back and you're like, okay, what is this? Why am I doing this?
A lot of what we do is silly, though. A lot of what we do for entertainment is
True.
silly. I mean, like soccer is pretty silly. You're just
Oh my
kicking the ball
God.
around. I mean, I love soccer, but like you can describe anything as being silly. Like if people enjoy it, I don't really see the problem. Now, the funny thing is that even if you hate what Bookstagram and BookTok are doing to literature, you can't deny that it's kind of saving the industry, at least in terms of sales, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
keeping the industry alive in a way. And Barnes and Noble is case in point.
Yeah, for sure. And I would also add to that as you said at the beginning, right? I have 2 literature degrees. I feel like all of the academics that I've had to deal with in those 4 to 5 years of being in academic institutions, they are all so excited about all this. Like,
Huh.
nobody used to be that excited about books. Like, it's very it's like a career making thing to them to see people engage with the things that they're teaching to this level, to where it's not just like a niche degree that only rich kids get to do, but it's something that people on the internet all over want to be a part of. And whether there's a performative aspect to that or not is secondary to this. It's a win. People care about the written word again. Like, it's good. It's keeping it alive.
Not to poo-poo too much on that point, but a big part of the criticism of Book Talk and Bookstagram is that people aren't engaging with the written word, that it is performative in a big sense. What would you say to that?
I think that there are definitely people who are not pretending to read, but sort of maybe playing up the amount or the extent to which they are interested in literature, because it looks cool and it is a trendy thing right now to be seen as somebody who cares about much more than just, especially since this community is predominantly women. It is cool to be somebody who is more than just a pretty face, or more than just like this society believes us to be these frivolous, mindless creatures. So we're saying, all of these young women are saying, actually, no, I'm a lot more than that. And look at all these books that I'm reading, right? Here's proof. But while there might be people who are just doing it because it's cool, or because it's trendy right now, or it's something that everybody's doing, or it feels like something that you should be doing, the majority, I don't think that's the majority, right?
I don't think so either.
Exactly. And I feel like I see a lot of book memes and a lot of sort of inside jokes that people share. And in order to understand those, or understand why it's funny, you kind of have to engage with the source material. So, I made a video about how everybody or not everybody, but there is a big community online on TikTok specifically who are really into Kafka, and they're making jokes
Yes.
about him, and they're kind of objectifying him, according to this one article that criticizes this community. And there are a lot of arguments against this, like, oh, young people are pretending to like Kafka, or they're making Kafka into their little special interest, or whatever. And it's obvious to me that the people making these arguments haven't actually watched any of these TikToks, because they are very specific. Like, you need to have read that specific Kafka diary entry, or that specific not so well known Kafka short story, to understand why this specific TikTok is funny,
The irony is that the people writing the article criticizing that Kafka community on BookTok, they themselves don't seem to have read Kafka and don't understand like the deeper implications of those TikToks that the Kafka community are like engaging with, right? This whole story with Kafka is fascinating though, because he was an author in the first half of the 20th century that wrote like absurdist humor, and somehow he's made a huge comeback on a social media network like TikTok, which is like mostly Gen Z and even younger.
Yeah.
Just quite the story there.
Yes, well, he had daddy issues and was not very happy with his
How
physical
relatable.
appearance. It was exactly. Was a bit of a hermit and just generally. I'm not a professional, in no position to diagnose anybody, but he probably had some form of generalized anxiety. So, very Gen Z.
Very modern, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
transferable. So Book Talk is mostly American. You mentioned that earlier. Do you care to speculate as to what might happen if TikTok does end up disappearing on April 5th?
Who knows? I think it would be very sad for a lot of people. Sure, a lot of businesses will struggle. I've seen many, many indie bookstores even talk about what a great loss this would be, but also just more generally for people who have found community on Book Talk, and like an outlet for their interests and their hobbies and like a form of expression. That would be sad. I don't really know what would happen. My instinct is to say Book Talk is just a manifestation of people's desire to interact with books, and they'll find another platform. Whether that is going to be Instagram or YouTube or one of these other Blue Sky, Red Note, I'm not sure. Whichever one comes up and rolls out a sort of user friendly TikTok like platform the quickest, I think will be the winner.
So it's not like Book Talk disappearing is going to dismantle this whole industry of social media, like revitalizing the publishing industry, specifically around romance and smut and spice, right? Like what we see in the publishing industry is here to stay. It's just that the platform is going to migrate. Now it might fracture a little bit, right? Because right now it seems to be pretty concentrated on TikTok. Some could go to Instagram, and then another half could go to Blue Sky or something like that. Again, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah, I don't think anybody could say for sure. And I think that's a good point about the fracturing of it, because there are a lot of people who make TikTok content who have already moved on to YouTube, just because in terms of monetization, that is kind of the best platform to be making content on. But TikTok does have this very specific algorithmic magic to it where it makes it very easy for people to blow up, quote unquote. And also easy to discover new things and get hooked on stuff. It's so addicting in that way. And Instagram has tried with Reels and YouTube has tried with Shorts, but still they haven't quite managed to reproduce that. So who knows?
Can I back up a little bit? We were talking about how there's kind of a positive spin to the direct line between social media, TikTok, and Bookstagram helping out the book industry as a whole. Is it really a bad thing if a young girl sees one of her favorite influencers talking about a book, just how she bought it and the cover looks nice, and she had her nails were painted really pretty in the video, and then that makes the young girl want to go and pick up that book? Is that really a bad thing, right?
No, it's not. And I think that there is a sort of, I was speaking before about gatekeeping, but there's even more than that. There's something going on. It's very puritanical, this idea that there is one way to engage with literature and that is the right way, and anybody else who does it via new technology and in a more casual way is somehow blasphemous. I feel like there is a lot of when it comes to social media and reading, a lot of people have rediscovered a joy in casual reading, which wasn't as much of a thing. I feel like prior to there being a book community online, there were either people who didn't read at all and people who read a lot. And what we're seeing is a growing community in between those two ends of the spectrum. And a lot of the people who think of themselves as serious readers are reacting to this. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. Speaking of having a curated feed, at the beginning of 2022, I started a book club where we were reading Dante's Divine Comedy, right? Starting with Inferno.
Right.
And it was a Substack newsletter. So every week we read one canto and they sent out this like long 1,000+ word little reflection on it. And the way that I publicized that was by taking pictures of the book and myself with the book and posting them on Instagram and using hashtags. And that's how 2,000 people found this, right? When I started it, there were maybe 200 people in it. And when it finished, there were almost 3,000, right? And many people DM me saying, I would have never read Dante if it wasn't for this book club. And the way that the book club grew was through the silly performative looking images, right? But real people are for real reading this very well respected canon text, you know?
That's so wholesome.
It is. It was wonderful. And it's silly to see people trying to detract from other sort of similar experiences and communities.
You have 2 degrees in literature. You are not elitist whatsoever, which is kind of surprising. It's not what you would expect, right? I'm curious to know, though. This is an audiobook review show. We review exclusively in audiobook format. What's the take amongst your peers, academia, on audiobooks?
It's hard to say. Again, I feel like there are differing opinions. And personally, I think, again, if I were to go to my university professors and ask them or get their take, I feel like they would be open to it. I did comparative literature at university, so multimedia in literature, it was a topic of conversation and of study. And I think it's interesting. I mean, there are features of the written text that sometimes cannot be translated to speech, but the opposite is also true. There are features of oral storytelling that you can only appreciate when somebody is sort of performing the text for you. My boyfriend works in theater, so there's a huge difference between watching a play and reading a play, and it's not the same experience. And I do think that there are certain aspects of the written text that are valuable and written text should continue to exist because of that. But I don't think that these two things are at odds. I feel like I like to do little polls on my community page on my channel when I'm about to talk about a topic. And I've asked people about audiobooks. And it seemed like the way that people who are not visually impaired use them is either in a complimentary way, like, oh, I read, and then sometimes I listen to a chapter and then I read one, and so on and so forth. Right? Yeah. Depending on where they are and what they're doing. And there are also a lot of people who are like, reading is not my thing, but I love stories. I love listening to these novels and learning from these other people's experiences. And that is deeply valuable to me. And I find it strange when there's this whole debate where people go to the what's the word? The science behind it all. Oh, what does the brain do when you're reading versus when you're listening?
Right.
And I see what they're trying to do, but also, who cares? Oh my goodness. It's neither here nor there. Do you want to listen or get to know different facets of the human experience? Yes or no? You know, I think that ultimately it boils down to the way that social media, to some extent, but also just human nature, makes everything into a competition. It's not, is listening to a book a valuable form of interacting with that book? It's, does it count as reading? Who's keeping score? I don't know. It's
Yeah, there's
strange.
no scoreboard, guys.
Exactly.
There's a parallel between Instagram, Bookstagram, BookTok, and this conversation on audiobooks. If audiobooks and social media are bringing people to literature that would otherwise never pick up a book, how
Yeah,
is that a bad thing? How is that a bad thing?
it's not at all.
Alina, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This is a great conversation. We could go for another hour easily. Really appreciate your
Truly.
time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. That was Alina from the According to Alina YouTube channel. She was here helping us better understand Book Talk as a community. And this is in the context of TikTok's impending disappearance from the internet, at least in the United States. That deadline is on April 5th. We'll see what happens. That's all the time for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern and repeats every 6 hours on AMI Audio. We also make ourselves easy to find, though. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can email us at audiobookraview@ami.ca for any feedback or comments you may have. And you can follow our Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.